This is McGregor's Travel Adventures audio tour guide to the Basilica of St. Peter in the Vatican. Use this audio guide with the accompanying slideshow to help you navigate from point to point and to view pictures to better illustrate the items you're viewing. The first 14 minutes of this audio tour comprise a history of the building of St. Peter's Basilica and may be listened to while you enter the building and walk down the nave toward the baldacchino, that massive bronze set of pillars and curtains hovering over the main altar. Or, if you have just finished the necropolis tour, find a quiet corner and listen until we reach the baldacchino. Welcome to what is purported to be the biggest church in the world. It is over 150,000 square feet. Your average Wasatch Front LDS chapel weighs in at just 25,000 square feet, so this is the same size as 6 ward buildings. There's a problem in judging a building by its square footage, however, because the Salt Lake Temple measures in at 253,000 square feet. But it's comprised of 4 or 5 or 6 floors. But I'm sure you'll admit you've never seen such a huge internal space, horizontal and vertical, devoted to worship. Entire books have been written just on the building itself, not to mention the hordes of treasures or the crowds of people buried within it. Let's start with a discussion of the building itself. The original structure on this plot of ground was Old St. Peter's, erected by Constantine in the early 4th century. That building stood for more than 1,000 years until the arrival of an unlikely character that would bring down that aging and trembling edifice. The person to whom most cursory histories give credit for the beginning of the new St. Peter's is Pope Julius II. True, he was the executive force that gave authority to begin tearing down such a venerable landmark, but he was not the catalyst, nor did he live long enough to see much of the effort. The man who brought the cauldron to a boil was none other than Michelangelo Buonarroti. As a 20-something, he had stunned the art world with his completion of his Pietà and David. The Pope brought him down to Rome and started breathlessly planning with him the most glorious artwork the world had ever conceived of, Julius II's tomb. But as the scope of the thing unfolded, it quickly became apparent that the tomb was too grand, just too darn big for Old St. Peter's. And so the Pope started talking to another guy, Bramante, about the problem. And Bramante told him that he needed to tear down the old basilica and build one into which the tomb would fit. And so, with the lust of seeing his unrivaled tomb in a stunning new edifice, the Pope went ahead with Bramante's plan. By the way, Michelangelo wasn't too happy about suddenly nobody returning his calls anymore about the plans for the tomb, and in a fit ran home to Firenze. Julius had to coax him back and keep him away from the project at the same time, and so he forced him to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. More on that at another time. And we'll come back to Michelangelo in this chapter too. The cornerstone for the new basilica, laid in the shadow of the partly destroyed Old St. Peter's that would go on for 100 years before being totally wiped out, was laid on April the 8th, 1506. Bramante would head up the construction for the next 9 years. Donato Bramante, 1444 to 1514. Bramante's inspiration for the new basilica was based on 2 classical Roman structures. He wanted to re-erect the Basilica of Maxentius and cap it with the dome of the Pantheon. If you're having a hard time remembering what those structures looked like, just consult the slideshow. The plan that he envisioned was a classical, perfect Greek cross plan. He was widely known for having built a perfect little Greek temple in a courtyard in Rome. But he knew he needed to build on a monumental scale not seen before, having a dome that rivaled the Pantheon's dome for size, but starting at much, much higher in the air, and the space beneath it as absolutely open as possible. And so he began building the 4 main piers that circle the main altar. They began life bigger than anything else had yet been constructed in Rome, and they would get even bigger. But by the time Bramante succumbed to old age, he hadn't gotten much further than those 4 piers and the coffered arches that went between them. His successor, Sangallo, working with fewer funds than Bramante, worked even slower. His main contribution seems to have been the raising of the floor some 18 feet. This was done to strengthen the base for the massive loads that would be placed on it, but it had a deleterious effect on Bramante's spacious plans. For one thing, it foreshortened his piers. Note the huge Corinthian capitals on the pilasters of the piers. They're some 20 feet tall. Corresponding pedestals were put under the pilasters, but now with Sangallo's floors, they appear to rise directly out of the ground. Antonio de Sangallo the Younger, 1485 to 1546. Sangallo's work went on for 30 years, much of which was spent drafting new plans to change the basilica from a Greek cross floor plan to a Latin cross layout, what it has become now, but not because of him. In the slideshow, you can see what he envisioned the basilica looking like. This model took 5 years to build and cost almost $1 million. But despite all his plans and work, by the time he was done, it still didn't look like much. There's a sketch in the slideshow that shows a bit of old St. Peter's off to the left, and all that had been accomplished on the new St. Peter's after 45 years. Enter Michelangelo. When Sangallo stepped off the stage, a couple other architects tried their hands and failed miserably, mainly due to their inability to control quality and costs. In desperation, a new pope reached out to a true Renaissance man, Michelangelo, hiring him and giving him absolute power of control and decision. Already 72 years old, he was procurement officer, quality control, project manager, architect, engineer, draftsman, and many other roles. His design set the basilica back on track to become a Greek cross, but again, not much was done to complete the rest of the building. His focus was on getting the dome up. He was in charge of the project for 17 years, but during 5 consecutive years, there were no funds available, and the work ground to a halt. By the time he finally got back on track, he knew he would not live to see the dome completed, but he desperately wanted to get the building to a point that the trajectory of the dome was literally set in stone. To that end, he re-engineered the main piers, adding 1.5 feet thickness to the outside, and building deeper foundations beneath them. Then he built and completed the drum, the cylinder that rises above the arched piers, until the dome starts to round out the building. Bramante's piers are already 150 feet high. Michelangelo's drum adds another 100 feet. Michelangelo's personal force against all comers, including popes, had established him as a demigod with respect to the basilica. For 20 years after he was gone, architects had to slavishly toe the line to his plan. No deviation was allowed by successive popes, and so not much got done again. It wasn't until Giacomo della Porta and Domenico Fontana grew kahunas big enough to persuade a pope to allow them to change Michelangelo's dome plan just a bit. When the plans were laid out before him, he had only one question. How long would it take? They said, 10 years, thinking that the old pope wouldn't live near that long anyway, so what does it matter? The pope knew he wouldn't last that long either, and gave them a deadline he thought he might live to see. 30 months. They were dumbfounded. But what are you going to say when the pope says, get her done, and gives you as much money as you want? So they completely changed how business was done in the building. They instituted 24/7 work shifts, only 1 hour off for Mass on Sunday. Men stayed aloft to eat their lunches, even when the summer sun turned their bread and cheese into grilled cheese and mulled their new wine. The dome began to rise at a rate of 7 feet per month. People who had grown up seeing the unchanging stump of St. Peter's began to take daily note of progress. In the end, they completed the task in but 22 months. Another year or so, and the lantern, ball, and cross were added. The lantern adds 50 feet to the height, not to mention a huge ball and cross adding another 25 feet. You used to be able to get into the ball, but not much to see there now. The unintended consequences of St. Peter's construction. While it took Michelangelo, the quintessential Renaissance man, to lay the foundations for the basilica and its dome, it took Bernini, the master of the Baroque, to complete the building and wrap it up in a bow. But before we can go on to the Baroque, we must take one little detour to see what the building of St. Peter's wrought in world history, even before its completion. Back when Michelangelo had still been painting the Sistine Chapel, a young visitor had come down from Germany to have an audience with the head of his Augustan order. While he was waiting, he of course played the tourist and saw the sights of the Eternal City. Not the ancient Roman relics nor the new artistic masterpieces all about him. He was a spiritual tourist. He sought out the medieval relics of the church. But instead of hushed, pious worship, he found a church bent on business. And that business was buying one's way out of purgatory by paying to view relics or climbing the Santa Scala, also for a fee. He doesn't mention his impressions of the hulking mass of the new basilica encroaching upon the holy edifice raised by Constantine, but when he returned to Germany and in subsequent years was cajoled by Pope-commissioned salesmen to purchase indulgences to fund the construction of that monster, he'd had enough. The mere fact that St. Peter's was being built in a city bent not on salvation, but on business and treasure, and that funds for its building were being demanded of his poor, pious Mitmenschen, that caused him to sit down and write out his grievances against the whole business and nail it on the door of his church in Wittenberg. It was the building of St. Peter's that prodded Martin Luther to spawn the Reformation. Through the resulting schism and the depopulation brought about by the 30 Years' War that followed, the church found its members, and therefore its revenues, drying up fast. Although Luther did not live to see the results of the Council of Trent, he died the year it started, the council did reform many of the selfsame practices against which Luther had railed, and began the great Counter-Reformation. Much of it was doctrinal, but there was a conscientious effort to match that doctrine with the theater in which it was presented, the architecture, art, and music of the church. And so we come back to Bernini. Gian Lorenzo Bernini, 1598 to 1680. If you were to go to the Borghese Gallery, you would be treated to the most magnificent sculpture on the face of the planet, for it contains many seminal works by Bernini, including The Rape of Proserpine. You remember The Rape of the Sabines in Firenze? Well, Giambologna carved it almost 100 years previous to Bernini's Proserpine. When you compare just the aggressor's hand clutching the flesh of his victim, you see just how far Bernini's art surpassed his predecessors. The Renaissance hand is anatomically correct, but obviously sculpture. Bernini's hand looks real enough to release his victim and start playing the piano. The Renaissance flesh is slightly dimpled, but doesn't match the violence of the aggressor's grip. The Baroque flesh readily gives to each pressure point in a way that makes the marble seem compliant. And so it was that this man, so vitally attuned to the sensual nature of classical art, took the lead in completing the finishing touches of the Basilica. First, he returned the floor plan to the Latin cross it is today, that allows thousands upon thousands to attend the papal mass. At the end of his extended nave, he built the imposing facade and capped it with statues of Christ and his apostles. It was he that designed and built the elliptical colonnade with its cloud of 140 witnesses atop 50-foot-high pillars. We'll get to that later. What we see now is his crowning achievement in the building, the baldacchino. The baldacchino, or baldachin, is the covering of the papal altar. Take a look at the altar itself. It might as well be in a Protestant church. It was as plain as vanilla, no scroll work, no gold or brass inlay, just a nice marble block, excavated from Nerva's fountain in downtown Rome, with some pretty candles. Now imagine you strip away the covering and just leave the altar in the middle of the vastness that is St. Peter's. You wouldn't even barely notice it. Bernini's brass columns and awning make the simple stone altar the focus of every eye as soon as you enter the edifice. The columns are huge, 66 feet tall and weighing about 2 tons each. The funky, twisted design is its own take on the 12 columns of the original baldachin installed by Constantine, 8 of which you can see mounted on the second level of the surrounding piers. The amount of bronze to build the columns and canopy is staggering and represents probably hundreds of thousands of dollars in raw material. Where did it all come from? A very large portion came from replacing the bronze ribs of the basilica's cupola with, surprisingly, lighter lead sheathing. But the rest came from the coffered ceiling of the Pantheon's porch, which also yielded enough bronze to cast 8 or 9 cannons that were mounted on the walls of Castel San Angelo. If you look closely at the ornamentation of the column, you'll see not only a million bees, the emblem of the Pope's family, but also branches, leaves, and even lizards. If those lizards look a little too lifelike, that's because several lizards' lives were harmed by the making of these columns. Their bodies were used to create the molds. Wherever feasible, Bernini applied natural objects to the wax designs in order to capture realistic details, as where a lizard crawls over the base molding or a bee alights on a vine tendril. This has been dubbed the lost lizard process, only partly in jest, for in the casting, the lizards, leaves, tendrils, and fruit were reduced to ashes by the molten bronze. After you're done gawking at the height and splendor of the baldachin, take a few moments to inspect the carving of the marble plinths upon which the bronze columns are planted. If you start in the southeast corner and then move clockwise, you'll witness the face of Giulia Barberini, a niece of Pope Urban VIII, who commissioned this work, as she progresses through a difficult pregnancy and delivery. Note not only the increasing distress of her face, but the fullness of the shape of the shield below the face. The final plinth is graced with the face of a smiling cherub, the happy fruit of the pregnancy and delivery. The Confessio. If you had the opportunity of viewing the necropolis and St. Peter's grave, when you did that, you were standing below the Confessio. It is so named in honor of Simon Peter's confession of faith, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of God," for which he ultimately died. This is what the public sees of the sepulchre of St. Peter, the slightly off-center mosaic set back in the west wall. If you saw the movie Angels and Demons, you might remember that the Confessio is eternally lit from the light of 100 lamps. It must be stunning at night. Besides containing St. Peter's sepulchre, the Confessio is also the location of the niche of the pallium, in which is placed a 250-year-old bronze or silver coffer, in which rest a small collection of pallia, or stoles. At least there are if you're visiting here in the first part of June. Every year in January, the 2 choicest baby lambs from a herd tended by the Trappist monks in south suburban Rome are sent to St. Agnes in Agone, a church on the Piazza Navone, one having a white crown for chastity and the other with a red crown for the blood of the martyrdom. After they are blessed, they are handed over to other shepherds up in the Alban Hills a little further south of town. At the beginning of June, they'll be sheared and their wool given over to the nuns who weave the wool and then sew enough pallia for each new archbishop who will be ordained at the end of June. For a month, those pallia stew in the glory of the proximity of St. Peter's tomb. It will be an ever-present reminder to the new bishops of the, quote, solemn responsibility which each archbishop assumes to shepherd the flock of Christ entrusted to him. Like the shepherd who carries a lamb on his shoulders, the archbishop is to care for the flock entrusted to him with the care of the good shepherd, unquote. The crossing. Because you might be interested, I thought I'd just point out a few things of interest in the central portion of the basilica. The 4 statues slightly above eye level are called the loggias of the relics, because each statue has a holy relic associated with it. Saint Veronica, the woman holding up a piece of material. According to pious tradition, this was the woman who wiped the face of Jesus during the way of the cross. The relics of the Passion, kept in the holy sudarium above, include a scrap of material with the imprint of a bearded man, brought from Jerusalem in the Crusades, believed to be Veronica's veil. By the way, it was under this pier that the first stone of the new basilica was laid, on April 18, 1506. St. Andrew, with the X-shaped cross. He was the brother of St. Peter and was the first disciple called by Christ. St. Andrew went to Greece to preach the gospel. The tradition has it that he was crucified on an X-shaped cross. The relic of St. Andrew's head was donated to the Vatican in 1460, but was sent back to the Church of St. Andrew in Patras as a sign of friendship with the Greek Orthodox Church in 1966. St. Longinus, with the spear. He was the Roman centurion who pierced the side of Christ with a lance. He is said to have converted to Christianity after experiencing the darkness after Christ's death. St. Luke tells us that the centurion gave praise to God and exclaimed, "Truly, this was an upright man." Luke 23:47. What was believed to be the Holy Lance of Longinus was given to the Church in 1492. St. Helena with the cross. She was the mother of Constantine. She converted to Christianity and performed many acts of charity, including building churches in Rome and in the Holy Land. Legend has it that on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, St. Helena discovered the true cross. Fragments of the cross and nails have been moved over to the Holy Sudarium in the Veronica pier, I'm guessing along with St. Longinus' spear. There is another huge collection of statues, 39 in all, throughout the Basilica, of the founder saints, or sainted persons who founded religious orders. Besides the four biggies and St. Vincent de Paul, you probably haven't ever heard of any of them, so I'll just point out the four biggies between the crossing and the tribune. Looking west, counterclockwise from your 8 o'clock, St. Benedict of the Benedictines, St. Francis of the Franciscans, St. Dominic of the Dominicans, and St. Elijah of the Carmelites. Elijah? No, he didn't actually found the Carmelites, but apparently there were a group of hermits who succeeded the prophet on Mount Carmel. The order reestablished itself in 1190. Now back to the dome. Above the loggias of the relics, you'll see a couple of inscriptions. The one over the lady says, "Inc una fides mundu refulgent." From here, a single faith shines throughout the world. Over the men, it says, "Hinc sacerdote unitas exitur." From here is born the unity of the priesthood. Higher up in the dome, you'll see the pediments are decorated with 4 roundels, or circular paintings, with the representations in tondos of the 4 evangelists. You can ask 3 different people what the symbols mean and get 17 different responses, so I won't try to explain them. Just know that the 4 beasts represent sacrifice, courage, inspiration, and divine nature, in that order. St. Luke is depicted with the calf, St. Mark with the lion, St. Matthew with the angel, and St. John with the eagle. Now, those are indeed way up there, but you don't really get an idea of how high it actually is from down here. Things are dim and blurry, but they're made so monumentally big that it fools you somewhat. See that inscription above the evangelists? It says, "Tu es Petrus, et super anc Petram edificabo ecclesiam meam et tibi dabo claves regni celorum." You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. To you I will give the keys of the kingdom of heaven. You're probably not thinking of the size of the letters, but if you take a look in the picture in the accompanying slideshow, you'll see that those letters are taller than you are. And they're not painted. As a matter of fact, there is no painting anywhere in St. Peter's Basilica. Everything is done by mosaic. The next thing you'll see is the interior of the dome itself, broken up into 16 sections. At the base of each panel is a depiction of one of the 16 popes buried in the basilica. Then come the 12 apostles, with Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and John the Baptist. He's at the west end. I don't know which one is actually Luke, but apparently his feather pen that looks so dainty from the ground is actually 8 feet tall. Above each person is a depiction of the seraph holding one of the instruments of Christ's passion. The only one I've been able to make out is the cross above Mary's head. Way, way, way up at the top, at the base of the lantern, you may be able to see some blurry letters. They say, "S. Petri Gloriae Sistus PP VA MDXC Pontiff V." An extreme abbreviation of "To the glory of St. Peter, Pope Sixtus V in the year 1590, the fifth of his pontificate. Add another 20 feet beyond that, and you'll find the only representation of God the Father in the entire building. You can see a close-up of him in the slideshow. Since you probably have many other things scheduled for today, I'll not point anything else out in the entire basilica except the Pietà. So as you walk back toward the entrance to the basilica, you're welcome to check out the many, many statues of saints and tombs of popes. If you're particularly interested in any one, take a glance at the basilica map included in the slideshow. It will at least tell you what it is you're looking at. The Pietà. Michelangelo completed the sculpture when he was but 24 years old, taking only 2 years to complete the task. Before getting into detail, perhaps a few items of trivia for your interest. According to Giorgio Vasari, shortly after the installation of his Pietà, Michelangelo overheard someone remark that it was the work of another sculptor. In a fit of pique, he snuck into the basilica at night and chiseled the inscription on the sash across Mary's breast. Michelangelus Buonarrotus Florentinus faciebat. Or in English, Michelangelo Buonarroti, a Florentine, made this. The signature echoes one used by ancient Greek artists like Apelles and Polykleitos. It was the only work he ever signed. Vasari also reports the anecdote that Michelangelo later regretted his outburst of pride and swore never to sign another work of his hands. In 1972, a mentally disturbed Laszlo Toth walked into the chapel and attacked the sculpture with a geologist's hammer while shouting, "I am Jesus Christ, I have risen from the dead." He struck 15 times, knocking off Mary's arm at the elbow, a chunk of her nose, and chipped one of her eyelids. In a much different time than today, the bystanders not only allowed so much damage, but they made off with some of the broken chips. Mary's nose had to be reconstructed from a block cut out of her back. After the attack, the work was quickly restored. I remember seeing it in the summer of '73, where it is now protected by a bulletproof acrylic glass panel. And now a quote from stpetersbasilica.org. The beauty of the Pietà's lines and expression leaves a lasting impression on everyone. With this magnificent statue, Michelangelo has given us a highly spiritual and Christian view of human suffering. Artists before and after Michelangelo always depicted the Virgin with the dead Christ in her arms as grief-stricken, almost on the verge of desperation. Michelangelo, on the other hand, created a highly supernatural feeling. As she holds Jesus' lifeless body in her lap, the Virgin's face emanates sweetness, serenity, and a majestic acceptance of this immense sorrow, combined with her faith in the Redeemer. It seems almost as if Jesus is about to reawaken from a tranquil sleep, and that after so much suffering and thorns, the rose of resurrection is about to bloom. As we contemplate the Pietà, which conveys peace and tranquility, we can feel the great sufferings of life, and its pain can be mitigated. It is said that Michelangelo had been criticized for having portrayed the Virgin Mary as too young, since she actually must have been around 45 to 50 years old when Jesus died. He answered that he did so deliberately, because the effects of time could not mar the virginal features of this, the most blessed of women. He also said that he was thinking of his own mother's face. When he was only 5, she had died. The mother's face is an eternal symbol of youth. Unquote. It is here that many Christians recall the price of their redemption and pray in silence. The words may be those of Salve Regina or Sub Tuum Presidium, or another prayer. After Peter's tomb, the Pietà Chapel is the most frequently visited and silent place in the entire basilica. I would invite you, no matter your faith or denomination, to take a cue from the faithful here and to ponder for a moment the words that billions of Catholics have prayed over the years. Curb your own dogma for just 3 minutes and soak in the holy faith of those who pray here as you follow along in the slideshow the Latin and English words of Salve Regina, sung by a group called the Daughters of Mary.
Salve
It's now time to exit St. Peter's Basilica and to enter St. Peter's Square. No, it's not square. It's not even rectangular. The trapezoidal shape leading from the basilica steps to the round area isn't even regular. The south colonnade is longer than the north, and has something to do with the fact that when they dropped the obelisk, they didn't do it exactly in line with the axis of the basilica. It's about 8 feet too far north. Oh! But since Bernini wanted to center his circle around the obelisk, he had to fudge the square. But you probably don't even notice once you're surrounded by the thing. I mean, there are a zillion columns and they're huge. Well, they're actually 66 feet tall. They come in 4 rows, and there are 284 of them. The roof of the colonnade is topped with 140 statues, a veritable cloud of witnesses, each representing a saint, angel, or founder of a religious order, harking back to the reference in Hebrews 12:1. Wherefore, seeing we also are encompassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight, and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. But where is Jesus? Oh, well, you forgot the monstrosity called the facade behind you. At the very peak of the facade is the statue of Jesus Christ, with the 12 apostles lined out on either side of him. No, not Judas, of course. He's been replaced by St. John the Baptist. Why is this a monstrosity? Well, can you see the crowning achievement of St. Peter's Basilica? Can you see the dome? I can guarantee you that when Michelangelo is resurrected, he's coming right here first thing and tearing down the facade and half of the nave so that you can see his and Bramante's glorious dome. Oh, and those clocks showing different times? When Bernini built the facade, he had planned to build 2 huge clock towers at either end. But when he started building them, they just cracked the foundation and facade walls, so it was torn down and never replaced. The clocks had already been commissioned, though, so here they are. Why 2 times? The one on the left is correct. The other one shows Ultramontana time, or European Mean Time, something not used anymore, and it's about an hour and a half behind. The wrong time on the clock may also be an attempt to keep the devil guessing about the day and hour in which the Son of Man is to come. Okay, now back to the square. When you walk down toward the obelisk, you'll see that the square opens to what looks like an ellipse. It's really an avato tondo, for which I have not been able to find a concise definition, but it's 2 overlapping circles, each with its center point. Anyway, that becomes important for a reason. About halfway between the obelisk and either end of the fountains is a white paving stone, just outside the ring of stone stumps. Go ahead and stand on it, and turn and look at the nearest colonnade. Do you see 4 rows of columns or just 1? Amazing. If you were to take a measuring stick and compare the diameter of the inner columns, you would find that somewhat skinnier than the ones on the outside. Oh, the stuff we never notice. The relationship between the obelisk and the colonnade is also something to regard. At the summer solstice, if you had been here at dawn, you would have noticed that the obelisk's shadow would have pointed exactly at the southwest corner of the colonnade, while at dusk it would have pointed to the end of the colonnade at the southeast. The opposite happens at the winter solstice. Oh, and remember in Angels and Demons, where Professor Langdon is looking for clues around Bernini's fountain? First of all, good luck guessing which one was made by Bernini. They're identical, but he only made the second one to match the first. Second, the movie made it appear that the paving stones with the 4 winds was part of the fountain. Nope. They're dozens of meters away surrounding the obelisk, and they point out all the winds. Oh, Hollywood. The Vatican Obelisk. One last thing before this tour is over. The obelisk itself. If you took the necropolis tour, you've seen where it used to stand, and now you know that it got placed off center from the basilica, and that it casts shadows to particular places throughout the solar year. And you may notice other zodiacal signs around the piazza where it casts its shadow at other times of year. But perhaps just a short paragraph or two about how an Egyptian, read pagan, monument came to be the focal point of the navel of Christendom. It is one of 13 such obelisks around Rome. There are more obelisks here than in Egypt, for Pete's sake. See what I did there? It's not the tallest one. That one's in another part of the Vatican, over at the Lateran Church. This one was originally set up by Augustus in Alexandria in 30 BC, then brought to Rome by Caligula in AD 37, where it was finally set up by Nero in his circus. It stood there for 1,500 years, not bothering anyone and not budging an inch. But now it was going to bother someone. The sensibilities of anyone viewing the basilica are seeing a stray whisker poking incongruently out of the side. Michelangelo had shrugged his shoulders when he was confronted with the problem. He didn't think it could be moved, only demolished. But finally, in 1585, the Pope offered a reward for getting the thing moved. Hundreds of half-baked schemes were submitted, but one man took the time to create a scale model and offered to the bankroll the thing himself, Domenico Fontana. He encased the obelisk in straw, and then boards, and then wound the whole thing around with 2-foot-thick ropes, the other ends of which were attached to 40 donkey-powered windlasses. On the day that it was finally all assembled, including 900 men and 140 horses or donkeys, the Pope erected a gallows nearby and threatened anyone who so much as muttered with instant death. He needed absolute silence so that the directions could be given and understood. After the trumpet blew, silence descended, and the windlasses kicked into action, slowly raising the spire a few feet. And then disaster started to loom. The strands of the ropes began to fray and to burn, and the obelisk began to descend. Amongst the spectators was a sailor who knew that if the ropes just got some water for lubrication, it would lessen the internal friction. But to cry out would mean death. He took the risk and shouted out, "Wet the ropes!" He was heard, obeyed, and because it worked, not executed, but rewarded. Eventually, the thing was raised high enough to where it could be placed on a specially built trolley track combo, then nudged the 300 yards to its new site, where the whole process was reversed. One final bit of trivia. For the 1,500 years that the obelisk had stood, there was a rumor that the hollow brass ball at its top contained the ashes of Caesar. Unfortunately, nothing fell out when they opened the thing, but when they raised a new cross on top of it, they did include some relics. This concludes the St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican audio tour. If you still have some time before lunch, you might want to go back to the Basilica and climb up to the top of the dome. You can pay €5 to hoof the whole 550 steps, or an extra €2 to take the elevator for the first 300 of those steps. But the climb between the two diverging halves of the dome and the final spiral staircase with a vertical rope for a handrail are both physically demanding and somewhat claustrophobic. But the views of Rome that await you from the top, priceless. And if you're heading off to the Vatican Museum next, you need to stop first and have some lunch. You're going to need the rest and fortification before you brave those long lines and halls.